Snow lay thick across the ridge and valley, a brittle silence pressing against the fragile walls of Maeve's cabin. Each flake drifted slowly, almost lazily, as if hesitant to disturb the world it fell upon. The early sun, a muted orange, crept above the horizon, spilling a pale light across the frost-laden trail. Maeve pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders, the wool scratchy against her skin, and watched the forest line. A solitary figure moved steadily through the snow, leaving boot prints sharp and exact, each step a quiet proclamation of survival. It was Elias. Maeve knew him by reputation long before she had seen him in person. He had been the lumberjack who preferred the solitude of the deep woods, whose axes and saws had felled timber as silently as the wind through the pines. Rumors traveled faster than the man himself, a man scarred by loss, living apart from towns and people, carrying ghosts in the shape of fire and grief. The children of the town whispered his name like a warning. Yet Maeve, widow and keeper of a fragile home, felt a stirring of hope as she observed him. Perhaps he was exactly the strength she required, even if she could not yet name it. Liam, her boy of 8 winters, peeked cautiously from behind the doorway. His small hands clutched the edge of the wooden frame, knuckles white, and his eyes traced the movement of the stranger as he crossed the open expanse. There was a careful measurement in the way he walked, a quiet dignity that seemed to acknowledge the presence of life and of survival. Maeve felt a stirring in her chest, a fragile hope she had long set aside. The townsfolk's eyes followed Elias as he approached, sharp with suspicion. Mothers tugged at shawls and whispered to children, warning them to keep distance. Men spat into the snow or muttered, shaking their heads. The whispers carried through the morning air. The man from the woods. Never settles, carries ghosts. Best to leave him be. Yet Elias did not react. He walked as though the weight of the world rested in the lines of his shoulders, yet he bore it without complaint, carrying axes and a saw in hand. Each piece of iron gleamed faintly, frost clinging to the edges, as if the tools themselves had absorbed the cold hush of the forest. Maeve stepped onto the small porch, her boots crunching in rhythm with the snow underfoot. The cabin had seen winters many years older than her, its timbers grayed and cracked, yet still steadfast against wind and frost. She swallowed and then spoke, her voice steady but soft. "Sir, I wonder if you might stay for a time. There's work to be done. Repairs, the farm." Her eyes flicked to Liam, and she saw the curiosity in her son's gaze, the tentative trust forming where words had yet to be spoken. Elias paused, shifting the weight of his pack. He did not speak. He lowered his eyes briefly, scanning the cabin, the small garden blanketed in snow, and then returned his gaze to Maeve. A nod. Not grand, not declarative, but enough. Enough to say he had understood. Enough to say he would cross the threshold between isolation and human concern. In his nod, there was humility, and an unspoken acknowledgement of loneliness mirrored in another. The boy stepped forward, barefoot from the threshold, and extended a tentative hand. Elias glanced down, a shadow of a smile brushing his lips. He crouched, hand steady and warm against the boy's, and lifted his axes, placing them at the cabin's edge. It was a simple gesture, but in it, Liam saw protection. In it, Maeve saw a bridge spanning grief and the possibility of companionship that did not demand words. The morning advanced slowly. Elias unpacked his tools, setting axes into the soft snow and sharpening the edges against a stone with care. Maeve observed the motion with a quiet fascination. There was a ritual in labor, she realized. Each swing of the axe, each precise strike, was more than work. It was a declaration that the world still had order, still had care, still had continuity. She thought of her husband, whose laughter had once filled the cabin with warmth, whose hands had carved this same wood with pride and love. The memory pricked like a thorn, sharp but not unbearable, as if the past and present could coexist if only one dared to let it. Snowflakes gathered in the curls of Liam's hair. He braided them into little threads between his fingers, weaving the cold into warmth. The act seemed insignificant, yet Maeve felt it as a promise, that life continued, and that hope, however fragile, could be tended. Elias watched silently from where he stacked wood against the cabin wall, his breath rising in white plumes, steady and controlled. His eyes held stories not told, scars unseen. But in the quiet of that morning, the three of them, widow, boy, and Lumberjack, shared a tacit understanding. By midday, the frost softened under the weak winter sun. Elias began repairs, hammering slowly, deliberately, each stroke echoing against the timbers. Maeve carried pails of water from the small spring, and Liam gathered sticks for kindling, his small hands learning the rhythm of work alongside a stranger who was slowly becoming a protector. The cabin, once just a shelter from the cold, became a locus of cautious trust. In the late afternoon, as the sun dipped lower and shadows stretched long and thin across the snow, Maeve allowed herself a breath she had not taken in months. She recognized the fragile beginnings of something new. Not love yet, perhaps, but the possibility of shared strength. And Elias, in the silent acceptance of her request, in the quiet tending of wood and wall, seemed to recognize the same. Companionship, tentative though it might be, was a chance to mend the fissures in a heart long kept closed. The wind whispered through the bare pines, a soft chorus to mark the beginning of a fragile union, as snow continued to fall, gentle and insistent, covering footprints and mistakes alike in its quiet mercy. The morning air was crisp with the lingering chill of snow, yet the sun had begun to warm the edges of the cabin, gilding frost-tipped pines with a fragile gold. Elias moved with quiet purpose, hauling split logs from the edge of the forest to the cabin's stacked woodpile. Each log thudded against the next with a muted certainty, a rhythm that spoke of labor as both necessity and ritual. Maeve worked nearby, kneeling in the small garden patch that had survived the frost, brushing soil gently over the seedlings she hoped would thrive come spring. Liam followed her lead, pressing his small hands into the cold earth, the tips of his fingers pink from the chill. They shared the space in silence, the unspoken language of survival and mourning binding them. Their glances occasionally met, Maeve's curious, cautious, noting the scars in the lines of Elias's hands and the tension in his shoulders. Elias reserved, measuring yet softened by observation of her attentiveness and the boy's tentative trust. Shadows of their pasts lingered in everything they touched. Maeve carried within her the quiet ache of absence. Her husband had been taken suddenly, leaving her to navigate the world alone with Liam. She remembered the last winter they had shared, his laughter echoing off these same walls, now empty and hollow. The memory pressed against her chest, a weight she could neither discard nor fully embrace. In the cedar chest at the foot of her bed, her wedding dress remained folded with meticulous care, its silk dulled by years of waiting. It was a relic of a life interrupted, a reminder of love and loss intertwined. Liam's hair, unbraided and stubbornly curling at the nape of his neck, carried the same melancholy, a braid she had meant to finish, yet never did. The act of care deferred by grief and exhaustion. Elias carried his own shadows. He had been a boy once, part of a family that perished in a fire that consumed both home and hearth, leaving only smoldering timbers and memories etched in smoke. Some of these timbers he kept in the woods, charred but steadfast, as if by keeping them he could preserve what was lost. His movements now, swinging axe and hammer, were a constant negotiation with the past, each task an attempt to build something living, something enduring. In defiance of memory's weight, the day wore on in a tapestry of sound and motion, wood striking wood, soil settling over roots, Liam's occasional giggle as he tried to mimic Elias's careful stacking. There was tension beneath the labor, a quiet uncertainty. Maeve wondered if she had misjudged the stranger, if her boy would come to trust someone so distant, so haunted. Elias wondered if he could bear to open himself to another life, knowing the fragility of human attachment and the certainty of loss he had endured before. Yet they persisted, drawn to each other not by need alone, but by the recognition of shared solitude. As the sun began its descent, painting the horizon in streaks of amber and rose, Elias ascended the ladder to repair a section of the cabin's roof damaged in the last winter's storms. The wind shifted suddenly, carrying the scent of pine resin and damp earth, signaling the approach of a storm. Maeve watched from the window, her shawl wrapped tight, fingers tracing the panes in absent-minded worry. The wind tugged at Elias's coat, forcing him to grip the shingles with careful precision, and she felt a pang of awe mixed with fear. He moved as if he were one with the elements, unbowed by cold or danger, yet fully aware of the fragility of life below him. Liam pressed his face to the glass beside her, eyes wide as the first drops of rain began to scatter across the frozen earth. "Will he be all right, Mama?" he whispered, voice tinged with awe and anxiety. Maeve's hand rested lightly on his shoulder. "He knows the world well, my boy." "And sometimes it knows him too," she replied, feeling the truth of her own words more in hope than certainty. The wind carried the scent of wet earth, pine, and smoke from a distant hearth, and she understood that life continued, in spite of grief, loss, and the unpredictable wrath of the seasons. The storm moved closer, and Elias's figure on the roof became a silhouette against the darkening sky. She thought of her own fear of exposure, of vulnerability, and realized that the strength of a person was not the absence of fear, but the willingness to act despite it. Her gaze softened, and she sensed that Elias too bore the same recognition. A quiet understanding passed between them, that grief need not isolate, that protection and care could be offered without possession or claim, and that even the most guarded heart could find space to tend another's life. Night fell slowly, and the storm broke fully, drumming against the cabin roof and rattling the windows with sudden, insistent force. Yet within the walls, a small hearth flickered, and Liam curled beside Maeve on the worn rug. The aroma of simmering broth filled the air, mingling with the pine and rain outside. Elias descended from the roof, muddy boots leaving prints on the floorboards, and sat quietly in the corner, tending the fire with deliberate hands. There was no need for words. The presence itself spoke volumes. The cabin, once a mere shelter, had become a sanctuary of patience and tentative trust. In the quiet, Maeve noticed small acts that carried weight: the careful placement of firewood, the smoothing of a braid in Liam's hair, the way Elias's gaze lingered on the boy with a silent promise. Shadows of the past lingered, but they were no longer prisoners of them. The storm outside was a reminder that life could be unpredictable and harsh. Yet within the cabin walls, strength and care persisted, quiet and resilient. By late evening, the rain had softened to a whisper, the wind sighing through the pines like an old, knowing voice. Elias sat near the fire, fingers tracing the edges of a sharpened axe with absent-minded reverence. Maeve moved beside him, bringing a cup of hot tea, its steam curling between them, fragile and ephemeral. They did not speak of loss, for words were unnecessary. It was in their presence, in the tending of fire, wood, and earth, that understanding and healing began, in that intimate darkness, surrounded by the scent of wet pine, earth, and simmering broth. Both felt a glimmer of something long forgotten, the possibility that companionship, even tentative, could offer solace. The shadows of their pasts would not vanish, but they could exist alongside hope. And in that recognition, they began to see that survival was not merely endurance. It was the quiet cultivation of life, trust, and the courage to allow someone else into the heart's most fragile spaces. The sky, once a pale wash of winter gold, darkened abruptly, as though a heavy curtain had been drawn over the valley. The wind picked up with a sudden insistence, rattling the cabin shutters and sending fine spindles of snow whipping across the yard. Maeve moved quickly, her fingers stiff with cold, securing each shutter against the oncoming fury. Her breath formed small clouds, dissipating as quickly as they appeared. Liam clutched a worn doll to his chest, his wide eyes reflecting both awe and fear, lips pressed tightly together. The world outside had turned chaotic, and in his small frame he carried the tension of storms not only in the weather, but in memory, the fear that the world could change in an instant and take everything from him. Again, Elias had already ascended the ladder to the roof, his heavy boots gripping the slick shingles as rain began to lash down in icy sheets. He moved with deliberate calm, hammering the loose boards with steadfast determination, each strike a counterpoint to the clamor of the storm. His coat was sodden, water dripping from the brim of his hat, yet his movements were precise, controlled, as if he were in a dance with the elements rather than at their mercy. Inside, Maeve and Liam pressed themselves against the window pane. watching the stranger who had stepped so quietly into their lives become the axis around which their world revolved in this moment of tempest. For the first time, Liam spoke the word that had been hovering unformed in his mind. "Papa." His voice was tentative, curious, and carried no certainty. Immediately, he ducked behind his mother's legs, hiding but peeking out through the space between her shawl and the doorway. Maeve's heart clenched at the utterance, a mixture of shock, tenderness, and something unnamed. She pressed a hand to her son's shoulder, squeezing gently. "He's someone we can trust, Liam. That's enough for now." The storm intensified, rain slicing through the thin spaces between the trees, wind tugging at branches and whipping the snow into frenzied patterns. Lightning flickered over the ridge, illuminating the cabin in stark, fleeting bursts. Firelight danced against the wooden walls inside, sending shadows that seemed alive, as if the room itself had become conscious of the tempest outside. Maeve knelt beside Liam, brushing wet hair from his forehead, trying to offer comfort through touch rather than words. Every crash of thunder reminded her of loss, of what had been taken before. Yet every glance toward Elias, steady on the roof, reminded her that courage could be quiet, deliberate, and protective. The storm lasted hours, a relentless surge of nature's fury. Elias descended at last, boots sinking into the mud, coat heavy with water, hair plastered against his forehead. Without complaint, he gathered the scattered tools, stacking them neatly at the edge of the garden, checking fences and the small wooden gate for damage. His hands moved efficiently, calmly, as though the storm were simply another task to be completed. Maeve watched him from the doorway, awe mixing with a deep sense of relief. Here was a man whose strength was not loud or violent, but steady, enduring, a shield that did not demand recognition. Liam, emboldened, peeked around his mother and watched Elias's movements, noting how he checked each row of the garden, straightened a bent fence post, and righted a small wheelbarrow knocked over by the wind. The boy's lips curled into a shy smile, as though he could finally grasp the abstract idea of protection, seeing it embodied in steady hands and calm resolve. For the first time, the turbulence of the external world, the rain, the wind, the threat, mirrored the inner storms he had carried since his father's death, and he realized that both could be weathered when one had an anchor to hold on to. The cabin, battered by the storm but intact, became a sanctuary. Inside, the warmth of the fire met the damp chill clinging to clothes and hair. Maeve poured hot tea into small tin cups, steam rising to mingle with the scent of pine, earth, and wet wool. Elias accepted a cup silently, sitting near the hearth, letting the warmth seep into his bones and, perhaps unspoken, into his heart. There were no declarations of gratitude, no grand speeches. The understanding between them had grown in the quiet labor of survival, in gestures of care, in the mutual acknowledgement of fragility and strength. Night fell with a softening of the storm, rain now a gentle patter against the roof, the wind sighing through the trees like a weary breath. Outside, puddles reflected the last streaks of lightning, catching fleeting images of a world cleansed by turbulence. Elias tended the fire, moving the logs with methodical care, while Liam and Maeve settled on the rug before it, sharing warmth and quiet. For the first time since his father's death, Liam allowed himself to relax, curling against his mother with his doll beside him, feeling a sense of security in the presence of the man who had protected them both. Maeve realized that strength did not have to roar. It could manifest in quiet steadfastness, in hands that repaired rather than struck, in presence that demanded nothing but offered everything. She looked at Elias, seated in the amber glow of the hearth, and saw not a stranger, but a guardian, a man whose scars were not barriers, but proof of endurance. The storm had not broken them. It had forged a bond, subtle and enduring, between three lives brought together by fate, grief, and necessity. By the time the moon rose, pale and vigilant in the clearing sky, the storm was no more than a whisper in the pines. Elias stepped outside briefly, assessing the yard, the garden, and the cabin's perimeter. Each step was deliberate, careful, a ritual of reassurance that the world, though wild and unpredictable, could be held in check by steady hands. Maeve observed him from the doorway, her shawl drawn tight, heart swelling with quiet understanding. The man who had once been a ghost of solitude had become something essential, a protector, an anchor, a presence that allowed them both to breathe amidst the lingering shadows of loss. In the silence that followed, punctuated only by the drip of water from roof eaves and the soft sigh of the earth beneath melting snow, Maeve and Liam knew something had shifted. Fear had been faced, grief had been acknowledged, and in that shared endurance, they discovered a new truth: that storms, no matter how violent, could be weathered with courage, patience, and the quiet strength of those willing to stand together. The days following the storm passed with a tentative rhythm, each sunrise bleeding into long, labor-filled hours that stitched the cabin and its yard back together. Elias moved with the steady certainty of someone who had measured the weight of solitude and found it heavy but bearable. He repaired fences, stacked wood, and tended the small garden plots, while Maeve followed her own routines, cultivating seedlings, scrubbing the hearth, and coaxing Liam into the small rituals of childhood, sweeping paths, carrying buckets of water, gathering sticks for the fire. The air seemed lighter than it had in months, yet beneath this fragile calm simmered a tension neither could name aloud. Maeve watched Elias from time to time, noting the slight furrow of his brow as he split wood, or the way his gaze softened when Liam pressed beside him, wanting to help. She feared the judgments that might come from the town should her son grow attached to this silent, watchful man. There had been whispers already: a stranger from the woods, a man without kin, a figure whose reputation was built on distance. And yet, in her own heart, Maeve sensed a truth she had not dared to articulate. Trust could grow only where care and constancy met. Elias, too, felt the weight of unspoken thoughts pressing against him. Memories of fire, loss, and exile lingered like coals beneath his ribs, a quiet burn that tempered his affection with caution. Yet slowly, in small gestures, tenderness emerged where he had long denied it. He brewed coffee for Maeve each morning, the aroma drifting through the cabin like a warm, forgiving fog. He repaired a rocking chair that had belonged to her husband, sanding rough edges and tightening screws until it sat sturdy beneath the hearth's firelight. When Liam's hair tangled or clung stubbornly in knots, Elias smoothed it with patient fingers, braiding strands into simple plaits as a protective ritual, binding boy to guardian, boy to family, boy to continuity. One evening, as the amber glow of the hearth reflected on wooden walls and the wind whispered against the roof, a group of settlers approached the cabin. Their faces were tense, eyes sharp, and voices low with murmured judgment. Maeve stepped forward to meet them on the porch, Liam hiding timidly behind her skirts. "We've heard stories," one man said, his tone cautious yet pointed. "A man from the woods, living here with your boy. Is it safe? Proper?" Maeve felt her pulse quicken, but she stood firm. "Elias is honest. He works, he protects, he cares for this home and for Liam. That is enough." Her voice did not waver, though her hands gripped the railing as if to anchor herself. In the silence that followed, Elias emerged from the doorway, dripping from the recent rain, hair plastered to his forehead. He did not speak, did not offer defenses, but simply tended to the small tasks that surrounded him, righting a fallen bucket, stacking firewood neatly against the cabin wall, checking that Liam's small boots were dry. His actions spoke louder than any words could, a quiet declaration of integrity and steadfastness. The settlers murmured among themselves, some uneasy, some impressed, but ultimately they left without further challenge. Maeve exhaled slowly, relief tempered by the reminder that judgment was never far, even when truth was clear. Elias watched the departing group from the doorway, expression calm but unreadable. His hands remained steady, fingers brushing over tools and timber. Yet Maeve knew the storm of scrutiny had been felt, and the resilience of character quietly proven. In the quiet hours that followed, the cabin became a sanctuary, not just from the weather, but from the watchful eyes of society. The fire crackled and spat against the hearth, shadows dancing across walls worn smooth by years of labor. Elias sat near Liam, braiding the boy's hair with deliberate care, his fingers tracing patterns that spoke of protection, of history, of permanence. Maeve moved beside him, kneeling to gather kindling, her gaze softening as she watched the subtle intimacy of gesture that had grown between them. Trust, she realized, was not freely granted. It was cultivated, earned in the small, patient acts of attention and constancy. Evening shadows stretched long across the yard, and the rhythm of routine carried on. Elias repaired fences without complaint, measured the garden rows, and moved as if each task were both work and devotion. Liam watched from the porch, fascination mingled with admiration, sensing the protective aura that surrounded this man who had once been a stranger. Maeve, seated nearby with a steaming cup of tea, understood now that the quiet moments of shared labor, care, and attentiveness were the truest forms of trust. Words could falter, but deeds endured. The tension beneath the roof remained, subtle and persistent, yet it had softened, transformed into something more durable. Elias began to acknowledge that love and connection were not burdens, but possibilities. Vulnerability did not mark weakness, it marked courage. And Maeve, seeing him in this new light, felt the first cautious stirrings of hope for herself and her son. Life, with its unpredictability and its quiet cruelty, had shaped them both, but it had also forged an opening for care, for companionship, and perhaps in time, for affection that could exist without fear. Night fell fully. The cabin bathed in the warm glow of firelight. Outside, the wind whispered through pines, carrying the faint scent of damp earth and fading rain. Inside, the rhythm of small tasks, the placement of a log, the braiding of hair, the pouring of tea, created a pattern of reassurance and continuity. Elias sat with Liam, a silent sentinel, while Maeve tended the hearth and prepared the evening meal. No words were needed. Trust was manifest in the rhythm of presence, in the care woven into daily life. By the time candles flickered low and shadows curled into corners, the cabin stood as a quiet testament to resilience. The external world, with its murmurs, judgments, and doubts, no longer threatened the fragile sanctuary that had formed within. Elias's silent strength, Maeve's careful vigilance, and Liam's tentative trust had created a space where vulnerability could exist safely, and where emotional survival was not merely possible, but probable. In the stillness before sleep, Maeve allowed herself a thought that had long been forbidden. Perhaps this man, once a ghost of solitude, could be something more than a helper. Perhaps he could be a partner in care, a steady hand in the face of uncertainty, a presence capable of nurturing not only life but hope. And Elias, watching the boy drift to slumber, felt an unfamiliar warmth in his chest, a recognition that protection and tenderness were not enemies of strength, but its truest expression. The sun had dipped low, leaving a crimson streak across the horizon, when the sharp smell of smoke curled into Maeve's awareness. She froze, a shard of panic piercing her chest, as the acrid scent thickened and the distant barn glowed with the first flickers of flame. Liam clutched her skirts, trembling, and Maeve's heart tightened at the terror reflected in his small face. "Stay close, Liam," she urged, guiding him back toward the cabin, the urgency of her steps betraying the calm she tried to maintain. Elias had already taken off toward the barn before words could form. His long strides carried him through the scorched air, coat clinging wetly to his back, hat nearly lost to the wind. Maeve watched, torn between fear and trust, knowing that he carried the same measured courage she had seen in him through storms, through labor, through the quiet rituals of everyday survival. The boy's wide eyes followed him, silent and riveted, as if understanding instinctively that this man, once a stranger, was now the fulcrum upon which their fragile lives balanced. Flames licked the timbers with an insistent hunger, smoke curling into the sky in thick ribbons. Elias moved with a precision born of experience and recklessness, tempered by necessity. He shifted beams, secured trapped livestock, and gathered tools, his hands blackened with soot and ash. Each movement was deliberate, each breath measured, yet the strain of effort and heat burned into the hollows of his body. Light from the fire danced across his face, illuminating the scars etched there by a lifetime of solitude, loss, and survival. They were not merely marks of injury, but the testimony of a man who had borne fire before and survived. Maeve held Liam close, shielding him from the heat and the falling embers. Whispering reassurances, she half believed herself. The barn groaned as the flames claimed more timber, and she could feel the tremor of fear in Elias's absence, as if it were her own heartbeat. Yet even in that absence, she sensed his presence, not through sight or sound, but through the trust built in countless shared days, in small gestures that had slowly bridged grief with care. When Elias emerged, soot streaked across his face and arms, eyes bright and steady. Maeve felt a rush of relief so intense it nearly made her knees buckle. He carried the last trap tools in a careful stack, each one intact, and guided the frightened livestock to the safety of the fenced paddock. Liam rushed to him, tugging at his coat, still uncertain whether Papa could be claimed so soon, yet instinctively knowing that the man had fought for them both. Elias crouched to meet the boy's gaze, fingers brushing damp hair from his forehead, offering a smile faint but luminous, a quiet acknowledgement of trust and shared endurance. The fire reduced the barn to a charred skeleton of timber, but the house and cabin survived, spared by proximity and intervention. Wet clothes clinging to their forms, the three of them settled before the hearth, silence punctuated only by the crackle of fire and the distant sighs of cooling embers. Maeve's hands trembled slightly as she poured a thin broth into tin cups, her gaze shifting between Elias's weary frame and Liam's wide, trusting eyes. Words, long deferred, finally found their place in the warmth of the room. "Elias," she said softly, voice catching. We need you, not only for work or protection, but for us, for Liam and for me. Will you stay? Not merely as a helper, but as part of our family?" Her hand rested briefly on his arm, hesitant, as though the physical contact might tether the question to reality. The silence that followed was neither empty nor oppressive. It hummed with the weight of the moment, the accumulation of months of care, labor, and quiet affection. Elias, still damp and blackened with soot, met her gaze. The heat of the fire mirrored the intensity of unspoken emotion, and for the first time, he allowed himself to acknowledge it fully. His nod was slight, deliberate, carrying with it the weight of commitment, trust, and a recognition that family could indeed be chosen, nurtured through courage and tenderness, rather than imposed by circumstance. The room seemed to exhale with him, the tension of past months melting into quiet warmth. Liam's small hands reached for Elias's, squeezing tightly, as if to anchor him as much as to be anchored. Elias returned the gesture, fingers brushing over the boy's knuckles, and in that contact was a promise that he would protect, guide, and share in the life of this small, fragile unit. Maeve's eyes filled, not with tears of sorrow, but with the quiet relief of survival, of connection, of a tentative hope no longer whispered but spoken aloud through presence and action. Outside, the night was still, the remnants of smoke curling into a sky studded with stars. The barn stood as a skeleton of what had been, a reminder of fragility, loss, and the ever-present possibility of ruin. Yet within the cabin, firelight and warmth rendered ruin powerless, replaced by the resilience of shared courage. The ordeal had forged bonds stronger than any spoken vow, a fire more enduring than timber, a connection born from risk, care, and unspoken understanding. They sat together, wet and weary, and allowed the silence to hold them. No words were necessary to convey the depth of emotion, the gravity of the choice made and accepted. Maeve rested a hand on Elias's shoulder, feeling the warmth beneath the soot and exhaustion, a tangible reminder that survival and love were not incompatible, but intertwined. Liam nestled between them, content in the shelter of two steady presences. The fire between them reflected not destruction, but trust, safety, and the possibility of life renewed. In the quiet that followed, with the embers glowing low, Maeve realized that courage and tenderness were not contradictions. Elias's willingness to risk himself for them had illuminated the truth she had long known but feared to admit. Family could be constructed from loyalty, protection, and quiet devotion. And in that recognition, the emotional fire between them burned steady, warm, and sustaining, not consuming but nurturing, a testament to the resilience of human hearts when given the chance to trust again. The snow had begun its slow retreat from the hills, giving way to the early hints of spring. Pale light spilled across the cabin, glinting off icicles that dripped steadily into the thawing earth. Birds returned cautiously to the pines, and the garden, once choked with frost, showed the first stubborn shoots of green. In the midst of this fragile renewal, the sound of hooves on the distant trail brought a tension that cut through the morning calm. Maeve watched from the doorway, Liam at her side, as 3 mounted lawmen emerged through the haze of mist and melting snow. Their eyes were sharp, their posture disciplined, the weight of authority evident in the measured rhythm of their approach. Whispers had reached them, rumors of old feuds, the unexplained deaths of a neighboring family, and the man from the woods who had taken refuge here. Maeve felt a flicker of apprehension, but also a steadying trust. Elias stood on the porch, his tall figure calm and unwavering, axes and tools laid aside in silent acknowledgement of the scrutiny to come. The lawmen dismounted with a quiet precision, boots crunching over the thawing earth. Their questions were direct, probing the boundaries of truth and reputation. "There have been reports," one began, voice low, "of conflict, of deaths nearby. A man named Elias. What is your part in it?" Elias answered plainly, each word deliberate, carrying neither defensiveness nor flourish. "I have been here. I have tended my cabin and my work. Those who sought harm have been met with the necessary means of protection. That is all." His gaze was steady, unflinching, meeting the eyes of the lawmen without appeal or arrogance. Maeve noted the quiet dignity in his posture, the unspoken honesty that neither demanded approval nor feared judgment. Liam's small hand found hers, and together they drew a quiet strength from the integrity radiating from the man who had become both protector and family. The lawman listened, studied the cabin, the stacked firewood, the repaired fences, and the small garden thriving beneath the edge of thawing snow. There were no signs of malice, no evidence of cruelty, only labor, care, and order. Slowly, their demeanor softened. Without further question, they mounted their horses again, a tacit acknowledgement that the man before them had acted with moral rectitude, that truth need not be loud to command respect. As they rode away, dust rising in faint clouds behind them, Maeve exhaled fully, relief mingling with a profound sense of quiet triumph. In the days that followed, the cabin became a sanctuary once more, but now the peace was deeper, rooted in the recognition that honesty and steadfastness had been sufficient to meet both human and natural challenges. The snow retreated completely, replaced by the tentative warmth of spring. The garden, tenderly tended, flourished with shoots of green and buds preparing to bloom. Elias moved among them with a quiet grace, stacking firewood, checking fences, and smoothing the soil around tender seedlings. Liam, emboldened, braided his mother's hair as she poured tea, his small fingers learning the rhythm of care and patience. These ordinary acts became rituals of connection, imbued with a symbolic significance that marked the passage from fear to trust, from isolation to belonging. Maeve observed him, heart swelling with the recognition that he was more than a guardian or laborer. He had become a partner in life's quiet endurance, a steady presence whose actions spoke louder than any words. She understood now that family was not solely born from blood or tradition, but chosen through consistency, protection, and shared labor. Every nail driven, every log stacked, every seed pressed into soil was a testament to this truth. Elias, for his part, began to acknowledge the subtle transformations within himself. The weight of past solitude and grief, once carried like a burden, had softened under the light of their trust and need. He allowed himself small gestures of intimacy, smoothing Liam's hair, guiding his hand in the garden, and even lingering in quiet conversation with Maeve beside the hearth. These moments, once foreign and unsettling, became markers of growth, a recognition that love could coexist with responsibility, that vulnerability could coexist with strength. By mid-afternoon, the trio settled onto the porch, cups of steaming tea warming their hands. The garden glowed in the soft light of spring, rows of tender greens and early shoots swaying gently in the breeze. Liam's braid twisted neatly along Maeve's hair, his small fingers careful and deliberate. Elias stacked firewood nearby, movements rhythmic and purposeful, a silent echo of the labor and endurance that had come to define their shared days. There was laughter now, quiet and unforced, mingling with the scent of pine and damp earth, a stark contrast to the fear and isolation of months past. In that simple, domestic tableau, the hardships of the frontier seemed less imposing. The lawmen's scrutiny, the storm, the fire, all had left their marks, yet each challenge had strengthened bonds rather than shattered them. Maeve understood that emotional survival was not an abstract concept, but a lived experience, a daily choice to nurture connection, to offer care, and to accept it in return. Elias's silent presence, Liam's trust, and her own courage had created a home where scars could coexist with hope. As the sun dipped lower, casting long, golden shadows across the cabin and garden, Maeve allowed herself a thought she had long kept at bay. They were safe. They were together, and they had emerged not unscathed, but whole enough to begin anew. Elias glanced up from the woodpile, eyes meeting hers briefly with a subtle nod, a quiet acknowledgement of mutual understanding. There were no words, for none were necessary. The life they had forged, tender and patient, spoke louder than any declaration could. The frontier, once a place of isolation and danger, had transformed into something intimate, enduring, and redemptive. Through storms, fire, and the cautious scrutiny of others, they had discovered that family could be chosen, that courage and care could coexist, and that moral integrity need not demand applause to matter. In the warmth of the porch, with tea in hand and spring spreading across the valley, they allowed themselves to feel the profound, quiet triumph of survival, trust, and love. Even as shadows lengthened and the first stars pricked the sky, Elias, Maeve, and Liam remained together, bound not by circumstance alone but by the labor of heart and hand. The scars they carried were neither hidden nor shameful. They were proof of endurance, of lessons learned, of life survived. And in that realization, the frontier no longer seemed harsh or lonely. It had become home.